Good morning and welcome. So I'm going to give a kind of anecdotal sense of the context for the thinking behind the exhibition and the reasons why we're doing the exhibition, and then give an overview of the work and show quite a few images. I think that this is an opportunity for us to look at a few images of Schendel and maybe think about some of the work that has not been seen in London before. So we're now more or less 25 years since Mira Schendel died. And I think that we're reaching a point where, in the consideration of her work, we're entering a new phase of thinking. Over the past 25 years, an enormous amount of thinking has been done about Schendel's work, but it's really been in the hands of a generation who either knew or operated in a context in which Schendel herself worked and existed. And in recent years, we've seen a new generation of curators and art historians who have taken on the job of thinking about Schendel's work and thinking around her practice and some of the visual and theoretical ideas that her work raises. And I think that with this exhibition project, what we hoped to do was to take on the entire body of work, which is in many ways rather a Sisyphean task. Schendel was an incredibly prolific artist. Although she wasn't, she had moments of intense production and moments of less intense production. She was nevertheless an extremely prolific artist, and the body of work is vast and incredibly varied, and I think this is something that has not yet been seen sufficiently well on an international stage, and so this is something that Tate Modern, in hosting the exhibition here, is hoping to contribute. But in recent years, as I've said, there have been new strides in thinking around Schendel's work, and I'm going to cite two examples. Isabel Whiteleg's PhD thesis, Mira Schendel, A Radical Passivity, which was completed in 2005, and Geraldo de Sousa Dias's book from his PhD, Mira Schendel, De Spiritual à Corporidade, from 2009. Both texts which advance research and knowledge on Schendel's work considerably, and yet the circulation of this information could still be assisted through the exhibition project and events such as this conference. The former has not been published and has not been translated into Portuguese, and the latter has been published in Portuguese but not in English. So I think that we're really at a point where facilitating a greater sharing of knowledge on new scholarship around Schendel is really an urgent task. From the perspective of Tate, over the past 10 years, we've become increasingly involved in exhibiting and collecting art from Latin America. And particularly within the exhibition program, this has meant the initial foray into Brazilian art in 2001 in the exhibition Century City, Art of the Modern Metropolis, which devoted one of the 9 sections to the city of Rio de Janeiro in the mid-1960s, and continued with solo exhibition projects such as Elio Itachaya, The Body of Color in 2007, and Silda Mireles in 2008, with smaller exhibitions such as the aforementioned Itachaya in London in 2007, which I co-curated with Guy Brett, and which focused on the story of Signals Gallery in London and the artists who showed there between 1964 and 1966, when the gallery operated. And Signals itself provides another precedent for the exhibition here at Tate Modern. It is the first and most important solo exhibition that Schendel has had in London, which was staged by the gallery in 1966. This was her first solo exhibition in London, and one which lasted for only 2 weeks, after which the gallery Signals Gallery closed for good. So that was really the inaugural moment for Schendel's work to be shown in London, and other than a recent exhibition at the Stephen Friedman Gallery, is the most substantial showing of Schendel's work in London to date. However, there have been a few opportunities to see her work in thematic contexts. Importantly, the exhibition Inside the Visible, an elliptical traverse of the 20th century in, of, and from the feminine, curated by Catherine de Ziga, which was hosted by the Whitechapel Art Gallery in 1996, and Force Fields, Phases of the Kinetic, curated by Guy Brett at the Hayward Gallery in 2000, being two notable examples. For reasons which I hope and expect will become clear over the coming 2 days, it seems that her work is relevant to ongoing revisions of histories of contemporary art, and yet also suffers from a lack of familiarity in international and perhaps also to a lesser extent Brazilian contexts, for the true extent and complexity of her practice. Over the coming 2 days, and continuing in a second part to this conference, to be held at the Pinacoteca do Estado in São Paulo on the 14th and 15th of December this year, I hope that we will be able to generate a wider understanding of Schendel's work, its Brazilian and its international context, and also to add a transatlantic and transnational dialogue, which Schendel herself participated in and also embodied to this discussion. If the Tate, specifically Tate Modern as an institution, is interested in challenging and expanding histories of modernism and contemporary practice, particularly in the post-war era, it seems to me that Schendel is an exemplar of exactly that complex picture. Sorry, technical issues. I'm trying to find one page which I seem to have misplaced. Here we are. Mira Schendel's work is profoundly complex and enigmatic artist who, as I've said, created a vast oeuvre. Her early life was spent in Europe, but as an adult she immigrated to Brazil, which is where she became an artist. But her early life is important for the foundation of her later work and preoccupations as an artist. Schendel was born Mira Dagmar Dub in Zurich, Switzerland in 1919 to Jewish parents. But by the age of 3, she and her mother were living in Milan, separated from and losing touch with her father, Karl. Mira grew up in Italy, drawing from a young age, and in the mid-1930s, beginning to study philosophy at the Catholic University in Milan. In 1939, however, Schendel was forced to leave the university owing to the introduction of anti-Semitic laws passed by the fascist regime of Mussolini. And from that point, she becomes a refugee. She departs from Italy with the purpose of reaching the home of her aunt in Sofia in Bulgaria. However, fleeing through the Alps, her journey is halted in Vienna because of the German invasion of Hungary. And she departs instead to Sarajevo with a group of refugees, where she arrives in 1940 to 41. By 1941, she is married to a Catholic Croat, Josip Hargesheimer. But she remains in Sarajevo until 1944, when she's issued with a Yugoslav passport. In 1945, the couple settle in Rome, and Mira works for the International Refugee Organization, the IRO. After which, in 1949, the couple decide to leave Italy and emigrate to Brazil, where they settle in Porto Alegre, towards the south of the country. During her adolescence in Milan, Mira's mother had married an Italian count who was director of the Biblioteca Nazionale at the Museo di Brera. And as I said, she also studied philosophy. It's very difficult for us to know how and when she became engaged with certain texts, but her library, this is a selection of some of the books from her library, a mountain of Heidegger, some Jean-Paul Sartre, and then some texts by Hermann Schmidt. So this is really a kind of succinct summary of her passage through phenomenological philosophy and existentialism, progressing from one writer to another and consuming each. I think, having grown up in the context of a library, Mira received an education and a cultural upbringing that led her to be a bibliophile. And I think it's understanding her bibliophile roots that really also helps us to understand the way in which she approaches her work and brings us closer to her thinking. In addition to this, I just thought I'd show a few examples of what she had begun to do in Porto Alegre, also at the very beginning of her life in Brazil, which was she worked as a typographer. And she designed book covers, and some of her work, her drawings were used on covers of books. And this is 3 examples. And I think it's very interesting also to look at the kinds of publications that were using her illustrations and for whom she worked in this kind of commercial way. But again, her life in relation to books. And one last kind of indication of her early life in Brazil. This is a photograph on the back of which is written a Song of Exile. Now, in the catalogue for Tangled Alphabets, the Museum of Modern Art exhibition, this is credited to Schendel, but I wonder if this is her handwriting. It looks a little bit different to some of it. But anyway, this is from 1949, and the photograph is of Schendel in Porto Alegre with a friend. So at this time, Schendel who's a very strong character. Reading the literature on her, you get an image of an extremely forceful character. She, having worked in Rome for the International Refugee Agency, when she comes to Porto Alegre, she starts to write letters to the newspapers about the conditions and treatment of immigrants in Porto Alegre. So and these are quite vociferous letters, which also elicit quite strong responses and defences in reaction. So this is a person who's not afraid to speak up, and also who is very aware of her identity as an immigrant. In Porto Alegre, Mira begins to paint, and her earliest works show a range of influences and show her working through both academic styles of drawing, but also various kind of modernist principles, cubist and expressionist principles. But and also perhaps influenced to a certain extent by artists such as Giorgio de Chirico and the metaphysical school in Italy. But the most profound influence in this early years, I think, probably is Giorgio Morandi. And his influence comes through in her still lives, which become, in a way, the beginning of a kind of philosophical exploration within painting. And an attempt to think about the world as materiality, the world around us, and our relationship to the world. Quite early on, and in relation to her move from Porto Alegre to São Paulo, Schendel mentions in a letter that she would like to get to know the work of Lázár Szagál. And I thought I'd just introduce this, which is one of the most iconic of his paintings. Szagál was a Lithuanian immigrant into Brazil, and this is one of his most famous paintings, the Immigrant Ship. And I think this is one of the artists that she says when she goes to São Paulo she would like to get to know the work. And I think it's incredibly interesting that she names Szagál as someone who I don't think influences her stylistically, but in around the thinking around her own identity and her predicament and her existence in Brazil, I think is quite an important early reference point. At this early time, she's also acquiring books and thinking about the work of Picasso, and this is one of Picasso's post-war still lives. So this is the kind of work that is being introduced into her aesthetic thinking at this time. And she also mentions in letters how impressed she is when she does arrive in São Paulo with the work of the Brazilian artist Antonio Bandeira, and which I think is the beginnings of her. You know, this is a moment where she's beginning to think about a transition from figurative painting to an abstraction, but it is something in which she's thinking around how to deal with abstraction. It's not something that she's immediately drawn towards, but she's thinking about this, the issues around abstraction. And Paul Klee is someone that she would have been exposed to in the second São Paulo Biennial in 1953, when 65 works by Klee were included. So as two possible sources for a negotiation of abstraction, one from Brazil and one from Europe, I think these are kind of important to consider. Schendel had a painting exhibited within the first Biennale, but by the time of the second Biennale in 1953, she again is accepted, but she decides to withdraw because she's quite conflicted around the direction of her practice at this time. But by 1954, she's working in an abstract style, and this is one of the paintings that date from that moment. By 1954 also, she has a solo exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo. And from this very faint image, which I hope you can see, she's also thinking immediately around the spatialization of the painting as well, because several of the canvases in this show were attached in a perpendicular manner to the wall of the exhibition. So this is something about how she's treating the painted canvas almost immediately as an object within the world in its own right. At this time, she's also the abstraction oscillates between pure abstraction and something which is a more ambiguous and indeterminate abstraction, something that takes on a kind of architectonic character as well. And in this work, you can see how the composition could be read as an abstract composition, but it can also be seen as some buildings with windows and perhaps a street. And similarly, one of the works that's considered among her breakthrough works, this abstraction from 1954, in which is one of the first works which she's trying to, again, break with the two-dimensionality of the painted canvas, the forms could also be read as some kind of architectonic structure. And some people have speculated that these kinds of thinking around buildings, around houses, around thematics of home, again, is something that also brings to mind the thematics of exile, but maybe this is a little bit too literal in an interpretation. What is clear is that at this moment in time, she also comes into contact with artists such as Alfredo Volpi. And Volpi is an artist who is experimenting with similar materials to Schendel, such as tempera. And he's also famous for a series of works called facades of schematized buildings, as well as his banners and flags, and then also more clearly abstract works that approach the school of concrete art that established itself in São Paulo in the early 1950s. By the late 50s, Schendel has met her second husband, Knut Schendel. They don't marry until 1960, but in 1957 they have their daughter Ada. And at that point, in the narrative of her work, we're usually told that there is a kind of hiatus in the production because she's taking care of a young child. But what does happen at this moment is Schendel begins to produce a series of small-scale drawings, all very similarly scaled, which are being produced in her mind to sell as greeting cards, Christmas cards. This is, Schendel is always has an eye on the kind of economies that her work is operating in. But I think these are important, not just because they are extraordinary and beautiful, but they also show Schendel for the first time adopting a serialized character and format to work through variations on a theme. So there are numerous of these. She produced a huge number, and I think that, you know, they date from probably between 57 and 62. And maybe bring up questions around the role of the artist and the role of the woman artist in the domestic context. Similarly, her first drawings, again in a more colourful use of different materials, this time ink. These are her first drawings on Japanese paper, in which the paper becomes saturated with colour. And whilst they're abstractions, these are titled, or they're nicknamed, bordados, or embroideries. So there's a sense in which Schendel is thinking, or they're being associated with a kind of domestic and a feminine context of the production of art in the early 1960s. In the early to mid-1960s, Schendel then begins to experiment with a much more hard and defined abstraction. But again, there are different levels of experimentation here. There are two works in tempera on board in which she penetrates the canvas and cuts out forms. This is one of those from 1964. And again, perhaps this relates back to the more architectonic abstractions of the 1950s. She's also taking on, I think, characteristics that relate her work in its closest manner to the School of Concrete Art, Ruptura, in São Paulo at this time. And I think we could compare some of her work to that of artists such as Hercules Barsotti, who's working at the same date. And again, thinking about abstraction and also a certain materiality of surface. The critic Mario Schamberg at this time wrote about her paintings. In 1953, we viewed the introduction of a new phase of Mira's paintings in which she used both oil and tempera techniques to produce difficult, austere canvases of sound ontological meaning. In these canvases, the rigor of construction and the constraint of color and texture revealed to us the unchanging, stiff, Parmenidean being in its identity. On one or another canvas, stiff and massive, being appeared, threatened by a devouring nothingness. Alongside these, Schendel is working in a much more impasto way on a series of, again, abstractions, but abstractions that relate to perhaps a landscape tradition as well. Each one having a horizontal dividing line across it. And there are also abstractions which take on kind of elemental forms, which I think is something also that Schoenberg is referring to in this notions of being. But I think it's important also for us to think about the possible contexts for these works. Within São Paulo, the work of the Japanese informel artist Tomio Taki, who is again working with elemental abstract forms and a certain informel practice. But also thinking back to Europe, the work of De Buffet and Lucio Fontana, perhaps also artists such as Fautrier and Vols, who Schendel must have been aware of, and certainly was through the writing of the Italian philosopher and semiologist Umberto Eco, which she had read. At the same time of these canvases, Schendel is doing something that's very typical of her, which is to work simultaneously in completely different styles. And she's making still lifes, such as this, Untitled Novel, from the early 1960s, in which she continues with the thematics of the still life. And similarly, thinking around the introduction of text into her painting, she makes two significant but cryptic canvases around, which are both titled The Return of Achilles, which have been related to thinking around the writing of the British theologian Cardinal Newman and the thematics of belief and certitude, of faith and certitude in her work, but which exist as also an investigation of the relationship between text and image that becomes quite an continual preoccupation and line within her work. And you can also see, again, the structure that exists within these canvases of somehow either a table or perhaps a building form repeats across numerous works. So motifs translate and drift across one canvas to another. In Mario Schoenberg's text, he mentions only one influence on Schendel at this moment, and that is the Chinese artist Qi Pai Shi. And these are two examples of his work, which I think, rather than thinking about his work in relation to her abstract canvases, must relate more closely to this work, which involved the combination of text and elemental forms, and also the introduction of, again, a new technique in Schendel's body of work, which is the use of inks and oil pastels on wet sheets of paper so that a diffuse composition arises. And these works, which are known as bombers, continue this exploration of a kind of diffuse technique that relates it much more to an aesthetics of Chinese painting than to the concrete art that was prevailing in São Paulo at that time. Again, Schendel begins to explore different thematics through the use of text. This is one painting which leads towards her work in monotypes. In 1954, Schendel begins to use a new technique, the monotype technique, and this is some of her most well-known works and most exposed works. But I think it's and it's a series that really defines the kinds of production that she is making. There are over 2,000 monotype drawings that Schendel makes between 1964 and the late 1960s. And it's a technique where she's using Japanese paper on an inked piece of glass, but with talcum powder, and then uses either a finger or a sharp implement to write into these drawings and the paper absorbs so that the ink, so that the drawing exists on both sides of the sheet of paper simultaneously. Schendel's philosophical research surfaces quite evidently in some of these works, and I'm going to talk about some specific examples from one of the sub-series of the monotypes, which are the writings. There are several monotypes bearing the word Zeit, or time, in which the word is either repeated as a visual sign for time passing, and therefore possibly duration, or the time it taken to repeat an utterance, or in which the graphic of the lettering is extended in a succinct sign for temporal activity. So this is a way in which the word itself takes on the form of its meaning within the drawing itself. Her philosophical inquiry is also evident in another series of monotypes around the notion of the void and being in the world. In the first of this series of 5 monotypes, which also exists independently in other versions, we see written the text "Nel vuoto del mondo," or "in the void of the world." In the second, we see mundo, again repeated, but with 3 concepts, words which are taken from existential concepts, Unfeld, Mitfeld, and Eigenfeld. These are terms which describe ontological states. Unfelt refers to the world around or environment, the natural world of biological drives and urges. Mitwelt, literally with world, refers to the world of social and cultural interaction, the interpersonal aspect of existence, while Eigenwelt, or own world, is the subjective phenomenological world of the self. And these are 2 more examples of individual drawings which take up this theme. And again, another version of Nel vuoto del mondo, and a drawing titled simply Universe, with the text Universo across the bottom form. This again also relates to drawings such as this from the early 1960s, in which the word mondo appears with texts and words in a multiplicity of languages, which becomes also a feature of Schendel's work. The linguistic sign of a displaced person, a person who's adopted different languages and scripts and speaks in different languages, sometimes simultaneously, muddling languages together, this kind of babel of language. Schendel's daughter, Ada, says that Schendel spoke many languages but was fluent in none. She expresses very evidently how Schendel switched when she was reading texts in philosophy from German to when she was knitting, she would count in Italian, to different kinds of use of language constantly. And this again is seen within a more cosmological series and religious and faith-based series of drawings which are in the collection of the Tate, the story of Genesis from 1965, which again uses different linguistics to explore the creation of the world and this theme of being and existence coming into being. I thought that this was going to be one image that was going to be incredibly difficult to show. This is a painting by Li Wanqie, who is a Chinese artist that Schendel came to know when she first came to London in the mid-1960s, and with whom she shared many characteristics of thematics around cosmological thought and existence. But I also wanted to relate this back to also Paul Klee and his ideas around cosmic and chaotic forces, which could be found in his notebooks, which were published in the mid-1950s in German and in a variety of different contexts and languages through the 1960s and are very much in circulation at this time, and bear, I think, a relationship to the kinds of worlds and spheres and worlds, and also this motif of the spiral that we see repeating through Schendel's work. In London, Schendel showed a series of extraordinary works called Dragonias, or Little Nothings, knotted together, twisted and knotted sheets of Japanese paper, of rice paper, that were intended to be manipulated, as you can see her doing in these photographs taken by Clay Perry at the time of that exhibition. And I also want to point out something here, the more playful side of Schendel. I think there's a sense in which Schendel is an extremely intellectual artist, incredibly rigorous, and a very hard kind of rigorous character, but there's also an extremely playful side. And I think this is something that will come out in works that we'll see in the coming 2 days. In 1968, Schendel's work was shown in the Venice Biennale. She exposed a series of works called Graphic Objects, in which text appears as a graphic element, but these objects also reinforce different kinds of philosophical and cultural ideas around her work. This one includes lyrics by the singer Chico Buarque and references to samba. This, which is shown both sides of the same graphic object, which is one of the most minimal of the graphic objects, incorporates texts by Max Bense, lecture notes by Max Bense. So there is a sense in which Schendel is introducing text as a graphic element that can be read from one side or another, and through the transparency of the medium, but also that these objects are still nevertheless reinforcing certain philosophical investigations that run through her work and which all relate to the concepts of being and time and corporeality. She also makes sculptural works at this time, again, which explore notions of movement, time, temporality and transparency. The Little Train, Trenzinho, a sheet of blank, string of blank sheets of paper strung across a room, or the Transformer Vase, manipulable chains of acrylic elements with hinges. And again, in a graphic sense, she's using text in a series of works called Discs in the early 1970s. But these also relate to her investigation around and her reading of Jung and of the I Ching. And these progressions of zeros through the acrylic plates are plotted according to the principles of unity expressed in the I Ching, but again might also lead us back to a figure like Klee, who had plotted similar progressions in his work at the Bauhaus in the 1930s. Such progressions also exist in the notebooks that she made, again in an intensive production in the 1970s, early 1970s, in which the similar motifs to the I Ching discs appear, but also the zeros spin round from one page to another, or arrows and movements, dynamism are expressed from one page to the next, and letters also dance around the pages. And I think that these works relate also to her reading of the Italian writer Umberto Eco and his notion of the open work, and how the work can become completed in dialogue with the viewer. So these works really take on the notion of the compositional elements that maybe you get from informel, of Umberto Eco's descriptions of informel. But in that text, he's also transitioning to a kind of semiotic analysis. And Schendel embodies that with this kind of exploration of language as a formal element. And the open kind of combination of series that you also see in the Tocchino drawings, which are, again, an exploration of the graphic qualities of text. In the datiloscritos, or typewritten drawings, Schendel also is exploring the visual qualities of text. And this one relates very strongly to the writing of Hermann Schmitz and notions of corporeality. It's basically a list of concepts drawn from Schmitz's writings. And I'm going to speed up a little bit. Similarly, we might think about the aesthetics of the open work in relation to her installation, Still Waves of Probability. This is an attempt to what Mira Schendel describes as to make the invisible visible. It is accompanied by a text, a biblical text, and I think she is trying to gain a sense of how to get at a transcendent being. But on the other hand, in terms of its materiality, it conforms in many respects to the kinds of characteristics that Eco describes in the open work. Similarly, at the heart of the exhibition will be a series of drawings related to the thematics of belief through homage to God, Father of the West. In a way, this series of drawings has also been described as a criticism of the prevailing patriarchal system of the Catholic Church at this time and the exclusion of women, but I'm not sure that it's really a feminist work or can be described. But it might be interesting to think about this series of 16 drawings as a contained series in relation to other kinds of practices around serializations of abstraction at this time, such as Barnett Newman's The Stations of the Cross. Similarly, thinking around the spatialization of the work, Mira Schendel also created the installation Variants in 1977 as an installation composed of 93 monotypes in acrylic, of which 92 are white on white and one is white on black. This kind of sense of an interruption. And just finally, to go through the last phases of her work, Schendel creates abstractions in the 1980s, incorporating materials such as gold leaf, and brightly coloured small-scale drawings, a series called Mandalas, which relates again back to her reading of Jung and also of the I Ching. Landscape also returns in her work in a series of drawings called the Itachaya Landscapes, in which the letter A, these are some of the final works which incorporate letters as a graphic element in her work. The A's populate the landscape and drift around, almost like a kind of series of human figures anthropomorphized. The last complete series of Schendel's work are the serafos, or batons, which were exhibited in 1987 in the Raquel Arnaud Gallery in São Paulo. A series of tempera on wood, white monochromes with black batons attached, and are some of her strongest and most rigorous abstractions, but may also be related to thematics of landscape and of being in the world. So that is my very fast overview of Schendel's work.